only got 12 o'clock, so we'll get started.
Cool.
Today's speaker for the Brown Bag is John Lambert. He joined us in October, working in our GIS department. John got a BS in anthropology and a BA in English and a GIS certificate from Iowa State. Then he went out to California to work on his PhD, which we're going to hear the subject of tonight. And he spent 8 years out there before claiming that he got sick of the weather and wanted to come back here to enjoy a lovely Midwest spring.
It's too sunny. It doesn't really agree with my complexion.
But John had done 2 years of CRM work out there, and now we've got him back into the Midwest. We're happy to have him working here at ISAS, and we'll hear about what his dissertation topic is.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. All right. So today I just want to talk a little bit about, this is mostly all my dissertation research. These are all early Holocene sites from northern Wisconsin, kind of just south of the Lake Superior shoreline. One of the sites is actually over on the UP as well. But the main question that I kind of want to look at is how and why do foragers use these really recently deglaciated landscapes? So I'll go through a little bit of the chronology, but the northern half of Wisconsin was covered in ice until about 13,000 years ago and change. And as soon as that opens up, hunter-gatherers colonize that area pretty rapidly. And then what's the role of mobility, in this colonization process, and how does it affect things like technological organization? So it's no surprise to you guys that archaeologists have spilled a ton of ink trying to think about hunter-gatherer mobility. Most of the things that people have written about have focused on various ecological explanations. They look at things like environmental variation, the distribution of resources, and how those play into adaptive variation. How often do groups move? How far do they move? Things like effective temperature and how far people move residents. And people have acknowledged for a long time that there's an important link between subsistence and mobility. Models like the travelers versus processors model that looks at kind of the trade-off between a focus on high-ranked game that is mobile and requires a lot of search time but not much processing, and then lower-rank resources, think things like small seeds or nuts that you don't have to be very mobile to exploit, but they require a lot of processing time. And then, of course, Binford's, foragers versus collectors model. And people do acknowledge that there are some extrinsic factors that affect hunter-gatherer mobility, things like social circumscription. But at least in these really early assemblages, that's not really something we have to worry about. Ethnographically, in the Arctic and subarctic, you see a huge range of how mobile groups are. Some groups are really sedentary. Other groups, like the caribou eater Chippewayan, move 300 miles north over the course of a week during the spring. So there's just a really large range. And one of the main things that seems to be controlling that variation is access to storable resources. So things like fish, and a few other things like access to trading posts, that kind of stuff. But for groups that are really mobile, so groups like the Chippewayan, we see this really heavy investment in technology that has to do with mobility. Things like snowshoes, boats, toboggans. So it's essentially paying to be mobile. You have to invest in that technology if you want to be mobile in this cold environment. So groups often gear up. You see these really intensive periods of producing technology in anticipation of future use and time stress. There's still a lot of unanswered questions about things that tie into hunter-gatherer mobility. One of the main ones is, how do different levels of mobility or different kinds of social organization tie into colonization processes? We know that Mobility has a huge effect on things like demography, birth spacing, social organization, what you eat and where you go to exploit resources. And these have really important implications for the fitness of these really early colonizing groups. It's also kind of unclear whether high residential mobility versus other kinds of organization, like, say, a collector model of logistic mobility, which one of those is less costly in a colonizing scenario. Cerevel and a few other people have argued that high residential mobility actually might be less costly. So, those individual daily foraging trips that you have to take. Logistic organization, you have to move a long way out from camp the longer you stay somewhere, so it actually might be less costly to make more short residential moves or long, whatever, just to move more frequently. But I think these are kind of important questions because the full-time use of these sort of paraglacial, recently deglaciated landscapes, that's a hallmark of our species. So I think it's really important to understand how and why people use these places. So I know I'm taking you guys out of your comfort zone a little bit. We're crossing the border into another state.
Yay!
Some people like Wisconsin. I love Wisconsin. So at least in this neck of the woods, the last glacial maximum was about 22 to 19,000 years ago. You see, the first, full-on retreat of the ice sheets about 17,000 years ago. And by 13,000, most of the state is deglaciated, and you see this really rapid move-in of Folsom, Clovis groups, but they pretty much stay south of Green Bay with only a couple exceptions. And this kind of so-called Mason-Quimby line, that's also the northern limit of where we find mastodon and mammoth. I'm not really arguing that people are eating mastodon and mammoth and they can't move further north than that because there's nothing to eat, but it's probably just signaling there's some kind of environmental factor or environments aren't very productive north of that limit. It's mostly pretty cool and moist. You've got open spruce parkland and boreal forest. So about 11,500 years ago, you get this brief glacial readvance. The ice sheets move about 50 kilometers or so south of the Lake Superior shoreline. But after that, they fully retreat from the state. They're out of Lake Superior by 9,000 years ago or so. So the early Holocene is a little bit warmer. It's a little bit moister. And the important change that I want to kind of focus on is you see the formation of this kind of lake and wetland mosaic in the northern part of the state. And we also see this pretty rapid colonization of groups north of that line. So these red dots are late Paleo sites. These are all pretty much sites that I've worked on and examined collections from. Obviously, there's late Paleo stuff further south than that too. Okay. So I kind of touched on this earlier, but we want to look at what's the adaptive response of hunter-gatherers moving into these really recently deglaciated areas. It's kind of interesting. We see a really strikingly similar pattern in other parts of the world, where during the LGM or a little bit later, hunter-gatherers, they stay south. They hunker down in places like Southern Europe or Southern Asia, and it's only after deglaciation that people move in, and they move in pretty rapidly. And then also just kind of a basic sort of cultural chronology thing. What sorts of changes in behavior do we see between early Paleo, late Paleo, and then kind of the early Archaic? Okay, so I won't dwell too much on this. I know you guys are really familiar with this chronology, but during the early Holocene, people move in pretty quickly, it seems like. Dates are a problem, I'll fully admit. But you see the emergence of, Agate Basin, Cody, Scotts Bluff, Dalton, St. Charles, Thebes. It seems to be this, people are really kind of pouring into this area, it seems like, from maybe a few different source populations. And it's not until later, the Middle Archaic or after that even, that we really start to see like wider dive breadth, lower mobility, and things like storage. So organic preservation in northern Wisconsin and the UP is terrible. The soils are really, 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 really acidic. Most sites have a really low deposition rate. So just to kind of give you an idea, these are 100% of the preserved faunal remains from late Paleo contexts in northern Wisconsin. So you could fit it in a shoebox and still put your sneakers in there. I mean, there's really not much. Most fauna that we do have are from non-cultural sites, places like bogs or marl pits. So we actually do have, a decent paleontological record. The stuff that is preserved is pretty much all burned. And same goes for macrobotanicals and plant remains. It just doesn't preserve. So kind of a consequence of that is very few sites have been directly dated. There's no charcoal, there's no macrobotanicals that you could run a C14 data on. We do have a pretty good record of climatic proxies, things like pollen or invertebrates from different bog or lake contexts. So like I said, kind of the big change during the early Holocene is you get all these bogs and marshes and small lakes that come online as glaciers are moving out of the region. The timing of when things like fish and waterfowl recolonize the region is a little bit unclear, but at least from genetic evidence on those taxa, it seems like it's pretty quick. We definitely had things like beaver and other kinds of small game, but importantly, bison are later. So people have kind of made the argument that maybe even these really early groups like Folsom were exploiting bison in Wisconsin, but we just don't see evidence for that. Bison are more of a middle Holocene species in the region. And kind of the same thing goes for other things like moose and elk and whitetail that you might think are pretty early. At least until later, there probably aren't very many of those guys on the landscape. The most common big game, at least from what we know from the paleontology, is probably woodland caribou. You might have a few late surviving Pleistocene critters like stag moose that hang around. We actually do have some dates on stag moose that go into the early Holocene a little bit further south in Iowa. Kind of as a package, boreal plants aren't very productive. They have high primary biomass, low diversity. You do see things like rice grass and different species like cattail that people use way later. But at least early on, people don't seem to have been exploiting that stuff. So that question's kind of hard to test, but at least from what we know, it seems like diet breadth was probably pretty narrow. So we do have some pretty good dates on woodland caribou. They span that late Pleistocene, early Holocene transition. They're actually in the region until pretty late, but at least historic times, really low numbers. They get pushed out after about 1900. So like just for example, the latest caribou in Wisconsin are actually up on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. I think 1928 is the last caribou. But the big thing for them is they just can't make it after you get historic logging and fire and an increase in deer populations. So one of the interesting things about caribou is they actually cannot overlap for the most part with white-tailed deer. Whitetail have this endemic brain parasite that, obviously it's not good for deer, but it's fatal for caribou. So you've actually seen a lot of modern attempts at reintroducing woodland caribou have failed because white-tailed deer have moved in the decades since the caribou left. So the fact that we're still seeing a pretty fair number of paleontological sites with caribou is also kind of another indicator there probably aren't a lot of deer on the landscape. So woodland caribou, their behavior is pretty different from the tundra caribou that you're probably a little more used to thinking about. They prefer lakes and wetlands during spring and summer calving. So tundra caribou, the reason they're so mobile and the reason they move hundreds of miles is because they're mostly trying to avoid wolves during calving season. So they move way out onto the tundra. The wolves pretty much have to stay back in the tree line because they have their own pups. But if you're a woodland caribou, there's nowhere to go. You're in the boreal forest. So they use these small lakes and wetlands kind of as barriers against wolf predation. So they hang out there. They're pretty predictable during those seasons. You know where they're going to be. They're a little bit more dispersed during winter, but at least ethnographically in the subarctic, groups talk about still being able to predict where, they call them deer yards. So there are these areas of kind of favorable snow conditions where it's not as deep. The caribou have a little bit easier time moving around, so they yard up during the winter. And like I said, they're really not very mobile compared to tundra caribou. Individual woodland caribou during the summer might move, over as little as 13 square kilometers. Entire herds only cover, a little less than 200 square kilometers. So compared to tundra caribou, they're a much more predictable resource. Okay, so what's the Lithic landscape look like? You guys have probably seen a lot of this before, but kind of the main pattern is that southern Wisconsin, we've got things like Hickston, orthoquartzite, we've got a few different kinds of cherts. You've got this broad band against the southern part of the state that has things like PGC and galena, and then a couple outcrops of things like rhyolite. And by contrast, where most of the sites I'm looking at are located, there's really very few good lithic resources. There's a few things like local basalts and quartzite, or in quartz. You've got some secondary nodules of things coming out of glacial till, but they're usually pretty low quality. Really variable nodule size, pretty coarse-grained. And then once you jump up to the north shore of Lake Superior, you start to hit some really good lithic raw materials again. You've got things like Knife Lake siltstone, or Animicky silicates. They're in this big band of iron-bearing formations. Those are pretty good raw materials. So contrast that with the distribution of all these lakes and bogs and marshes. If you look at, say total miles of shoreline or number of lakes, the density of those patches is highest where the lithic raw materials are the worst. So you've got this kind of mismatch between where stone is and where resources are. So I think one of the most interesting possible changes we see during this time period is, I think, pretty compelling evidence for the introduction of boat technology. So this is a little bit of a spoiler for the end of the talk, but we see a lot of indirect evidence in the Great Lakes. Things like early Holocene sites show up on islands for the first time. Lithic raw materials cross major drainages really frequently in ways they didn't before. We see the introduction of woodworking toolkits like adzes, wedges, and actually these kind of big bifacial chipstone adzes are diagnostic of late paleo sites in northern Wisconsin. You don't see them earlier, and then later archaic adzes look pretty different. And at least in contemporary Dalton sites, the adzes have wood and charred wood polish, which is exactly what we'd expect to see if people are making dugouts. Unfortunately, the raw materials like basalt and rhyolite are terrible for use-wear, so we really haven't been able to do it on the ones from Wisconsin. But they have the same kinds of really heavy polish, really heavy edge grinding. They're frequently exhausted. Sites have a lot of them in some cases. And again, it's kind of circumstantial, but the fact that you're surrounded by spruce parkland, and that's one of the best trees for making dugouts, at least it's possible. So ethnographically, dugouts are pretty widespread. And one of the really interesting things that people don't really think about with dugouts is, compared to something like a birch bark canoe, they're actually a really expedient piece of technology. You can make a dugout, say in practice in a couple days, whereas a birch bark canoe takes more on the order of like weeks or a month or a couple months. So dugouts, at least ethnographically, are frequently abandoned or cached when people don't need them anymore. They really are not as much of an investment as other kinds of boats. The earliest preserved dugouts in North America are 6,800 years and change. They're associated with archaic groups, but it wouldn't be all that surprising if the earliest boats are a couple thousand years before that and just weren't preserved. So what do we see ethnographically when people get new transportation tech? Groups in the Arctic and subarctic, they respond to easier travel, reduced search costs by getting less mobile, they rely more on big game, and they spend less time at individual sites. I didn't notice until pretty recently that the name of the snowmobile is the Enticer. Awesome. So one kind of tool that we can use to think about how changes in environmental productivity and new technology might affect mobility is the marginal value theorem. So just real basically, marginal value theorem tries to look at if you're a forager and you're faced with a patchy environment, so resources occur in some places but not in others, what do? How long do you hang out in any given site? So a patch, it can be one resource, it can be a number of resources, but the model kind of assumes that patches are islands. So you go to one place, you exploit some resources, and you have to cross some distance before you get to the next patch. So kind of one of the interesting things is, or basically the basic prediction of the model, you should hang out in a patch until the rate of return, so the amount of resources you're gathering per hour or whatever, reaches the average for the environment overall. And kind of an unexpected prediction that people don't think about is that if you're an economically rational forager, you really shouldn't hang out in a place until you use all the resources in a patch. You should actually leave before that. So I mean, you guys have all picked blueberries or like raspberries or something before. You don't sit there and pick every single berry on the bush, right? You pick a few and they get harder and harder to reach and you're getting jabbed by more thorns and you're going to leave before you get every single one. So think of it kind of like that. So there are a bunch of different factors that can affect how long you hang out in a patch. And the one that archaeologists have actually used this model for the most is an increase or a decrease in patch quality. But I think this is kind of, if you actually look at the way the model is put together, it actually doesn't have very clear predictions for if you should stay longer or leave, stay less time. Patches can get more productive and people can spend the exact same amount of time in a patch. The thing that does have really clear predictions with MVT is a change in the number of patches. So this is kind of analogous to our situation where you get an increase in the number of lake and wetland patches in northern Wisconsin during the early Holocene. So if there are more patches, so travel time is on the left side of this graph, so travel time goes down. So as a result, the average rate of return for the environment goes up. It's less costly to move between patches, and you should leave sooner. Because travel time isn't free. You have to make, kind of principled choices about how long you're going to stay somewhere before you move. So the reverse is true. If patches get less numerous, you should stay longer in a patch before you leave. Okay, so what does this mean for northern Wisconsin? There's kind of two things going on. So patches become more numerous, and I think we see the introduction of this new transportation technology. So not only do patches get closer together in distance, they get closer together in time or cost. So it's easier to move between places. So as a result, we should probably expect to see high levels of mobility and short site residence times. The fact that we've got these high-quality lithic materials in the south, really productive environments like wetlands in the north. Maybe we should expect to see a north-south pattern of seasonal mobility with things like long-distance rapid moves between the south and then resource areas in the north, and then a whole bunch of short moves once you get there. And these are actually really different from, these predictions are different from what people have kind of tried to speculate about late Paleo stuff in the region in the past. People have recognized that wetlands and marshes were really important for these early groups for a long time, so that's not really different. But archaeologists have looked at this big increase in the number of, say, different projectile point types and said, ooh, it's a really dense social landscape now. So people should get less mobile, they should move around less. And I've also argued that people should start using more kind of like local resources, but at least from what we know from the paleontology, that doesn't really seem to be what's going on at this time period. So if people are really mobile, what should we look for? We should see higher diversity in raw material assemblages, more kinds of exotic material. Archaeologists have argued ad nauseum that really mobile hunter-gatherer groups should use bifaces and flake blanks instead of big blocky cores because they're more efficient in terms of weight to usable tool edge. People should hang on to their tools for a long time and retouch them. As opposed to lower mobility groups that have more expedient tools, they don't reuse tools as much. And generally kind of a lower diversity of sort of generalized multifunctional tools. Okay. So at least as part of my dissertation research, I looked at 9 late Paleolithic assemblages. These are all in situ buried sites, which are actually really rare in the region. We're mostly looking at a surface record for this time period for the most part. This picture is kind of a blast from the past. Tom wasn't as aerodynamic then. So it was a combo of reanalysis of extant collections, some survey, some excavation. I did try and take one OSL date, or a couple OSL dates from a site in northern Wisconsin. Very few of these sites are directly dated because of the bad organic preservation. The dates came out totally wonky. Partial rebleaching of the grains in these like braided outwash streams is a really huge problem, so the dates came back 3,000 years too young, even though this is in early Holocene glacial outwash sediment. So yeah, my advisor was very helpful and ridiculed me after I showed him the dates. So disclaimer, basically we only have geomorphology and typology to go on as far as the timing goes. Where our sites, they're uniformly in these kind of raised areas that overlook rivers, seasonal marshes, wetlands. They'll be up on usually like the second terrace above rivers or on these little hills and rises. This is actually an artificial reservoir, but it would have been a seasonal marsh prehistorically. So good places to monitor game that are coming into these patches. Site structure is nothing to write home about. I mean, it's about what you would expect for sites that are made by small, really mobile hunter-gatherer groups. They've maybe got one or a couple concentrations of things without real defined features or the formation of activity areas. The sites are generally not very dense. They have a few hundred to a few thousand pieces for the most part. So yeah, a lot of the cool GIS I wanted to do doesn't work out so good when you only have a couple hundred pieces at a site. So raw material transport, that's about what we would have thought if groups are really mobile and they're doing these long distance moves from the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state. Transport distances are really long. The shortest average distances at sites are about 80 kilometers. And these are these sites that are down in southern Wisconsin, really close to the Hickston source. And then average distances at some of the northern sites are well over 200 kilometers. And if you actually kind of look at the total range, you see, materials moving up from southern Wisconsin, and then also materials moving down from the north shore of Lake Superior. So either groups are moving around the west side of the lake and going up there, or they're at least utilizing these kind of like secondary till and cobble sources that are up in the northern part of the state. So they're preferentially using, long distance exotic raw materials for the most part. Okay, so I hate pie charts, I'm sorry, but it's kind of the easiest way to show this. Straight distance to the Hixton, so Hixton orthoquartzite is the dominant exotic raw material in most of these assemblages. It's really strongly preferred for things like projectile points and end scrapers and a few other kinds of tools. But just straight distance to the Hixton source actually isn't a very good predictor of how much Hixton is in sites. So you see a couple really striking outliers that are at similar distances to the source but have much lower proportions of Hixton in the assemblages. So, over here in kind of northeast Wisconsin, the UP, you see, there's still Hixton, but people are picking up more of these local basalts and quartzes and rhyolites. And then in northwest Wisconsin, people are restocking with these North Shore raw materials like the Animikie silicates and the Knife Lake siltstone. So I think what's actually going on is we see some sites that are probably earlier in a seasonal round and some sites that are later. So it's not necessarily distance that's explaining, how much, say, Hixton or Prairie du Chien is in an assemblage. It's more time. So groups are swinging up north and then they're coming back south on the way and they restock on these local materials on their way back. So you can look at it a bunch of different ways, but just for example, raw material weight kind of shows a similar pattern where these assemblages that I think are later in the seasonal round, the Hixton debitage is smaller, it's not as heavy, it seems like the cores are more reduced and a little more exhausted once they get to that point in the round. So you can also look at a bunch of other characteristics of lithic assemblages to kind of try and get at mobility and site occupation time. One of the interesting ones that people have looked at is the ratio of debitage to non-local tools. So if you think about how debitage is produced, you make it on site and you don't transport it. So the longer you hang out somewhere, the more debitage there should be. And kind of on the flip side of that, there are fewer, at least relatively fewer, non-local tools. You transport those from somewhere else and you bring them into the site. And then kind of by similar logic, the longer you hang out somewhere, the more you're going to exhaust the raw material that you bring in. So we should see an increase in the amount of local material that's used relative to non-local material. So it should increase as occupations get longer, but kind of also as site function changes, sort of as a result of that. These real short-term sites like kill sites, to short-term camps, and then longer-term kinds of seasonal bases or places that are occupied for a long time. So where does the northern Wisconsin stuff fall? It's all of these red dots. If we compare them to a sample of just Folsom sites, they all fall in line with Folsom kill sites and short-term camps. So it seems like site occupation time was pretty low. Okay, so this is a little kind of hard to look at. So these are cumulative tool frequency graphs. So say this site, for example, has a lot of retouch flake tools. So they kind of break out into a couple groups. So for starters, most of these assemblages are pretty functionally redundant. They have the same kinds of things in all the assemblages. Most of them are dominated by projectile points, scrapers, adzes, and a handful of expedient retouch flake tools. But things actually kind of do break out a little bit if you look at these sites that seem to be earlier in the seasonal round versus later. These two ones on the bottom, those are really close to the Hixton source. It seems like people are basically going through so rapidly that they don't really have much time to drop anything. So your non-local tools. You're not even there long enough to expend many tools. It's basically a little bit of retouch and a little bit of debitage, a few expedient flake tools. The blue site up at the top, that's basically a pile of as-is. So possible gearing up for Dugout Canoes on your way north. There are actually other sites that aren't in this sample that show kind of a similar pattern where you have, 10 as-is up to dozens and dozens and dozens of as-is at some of these more southern sites. Dead Man Slough, this guy right here. It's a little funky. It mostly looks like the other sites that cluster in the middle, but you kind of got this weird, I'll talk about it in a minute, maybe kind of a ritual or kind of special purpose event that went in there that kind of messed with the pattern a little bit. And Gordo is really funky. I'll show you what Gordo has in a second. So Gordo is way on the northern end of these sites up on the upper peninsula of Michigan. Okay, so here's the lithic porn you were all waiting for. The projectile points are big, they're cool, they're flashy, they're really well made. By and large, they're mostly dominated by Hixton. You have some other materials like PEC that show up a fair amount. Some points that are made on basalt or rhyolite. Gordo is really weird. So this is the Gordo assemblage down here. It's way up on the upper peninsula of Michigan, but you see this big assemblage of points, along with some bifaces and adzes, that was all discarded as part of one event. So the points are intentionally fractured or snapped and then burned, and they're disposed along with some nuggets of native galena, so lead ore. Dead Man actually has the same thing going on, so that's one of the sites that was kind of up in north central Wisconsin. It looks kind of like a normal short-term residential occupation where something triggered one of these events, and then you get a whole bunch of these big, kind of early stage bifaces along with points and adzes that are intentionally fractured, burned, and discarded along with actually native copper and galena. So really interesting in terms of kind of potential ritual implications. It's part of what Tom and other people have talked about as part of the Rainier ceremonial complex. So at least at Rainier, this kind of behavior is associated with burned human remains. So maybe we're looking at cremations. Sort of hard to say because of the terrible organic preservation. We don't have any bone at these sites. But kind of one thing I also want to highlight about Gordo, it was deposited as part of one event, but you have, Scotts Bluff, Hardin, Thebes, St. Charles, I don't know what the heck that thing is. So this typological variation is cross-cutting what seems to be kind of a common adaptive strategy. And even points that are kind of typically, segregated into late Paleo and early Archaic. They all pretty much seem to be doing the same thing. So woodworking, all the sites have at least one or a couple adzes. The sites that are further south have more adzes. The sites that are in the north have fewer. So maybe that's evidence for gearing up on dugout canoes or other kinds of similar organic technology. Maybe you hang on to a few adzes for, maintenance of those boats. They all have really heavy polish, really heavy edge grinding. They're frequently exhausted when we find them. So whatever kind of woodworking they're doing a lot of it. And we know they're not building structures. So my money would be on boats. They've got a different package of raw materials from the points and the scrapers. They're usually made on things like basalt or rhyolite. Sometimes this knife-like siltstone from the northern shore of Lake Superior. One of kind of the cool things, these are actually the adzes from Dead Man, and we actually see some adzes that are intentionally fractured and discarded along with the points and the bifaces as well. So it's not just adzes. Hide working tools like end scrapers are ubiquitous in these sites. So that's probably evidence for hide prep and the preparation of sewn leather clothing, which is a really crucial technology for winter mobile groups in the subarctic and the Arctic. So we also have tools that a lot of people have kind of speculated are part of these eyed bone needle production toolkits. Things like spurred gravers are really common at Paleoindian sites in the Great Lakes in the Northeast. They co-occur with these kind of grooved sandstone abraders, and in some sites where there's good preservation, you also get these eyed bone needles. So possibly all kind of part of this clothing production and sewing toolkit. One of the things that actually didn't fit what I expected to see was how people are transporting raw materials. People like Kelly and Todd and Kuhn and all sorts of guys have argued that if you're a mobile hunter-gatherer, you should transport rock in the form of bifaces. So if you're using blocky, kind of amorphous cores, you lose a lot of the weight of that raw material when you're reducing it. They're heavy, they're not as efficient, but that's not what we see in these late paleo sites in northern Wisconsin. You've got, it's not that surprising that local raw materials would be occurring with these big blocky cores, but even the non-local exotic raw materials are over 50% blocky amorphous core debitage at all sites. So that doesn't really fit what we would expect. I don't think it's saying that people are less mobile than we thought, but I think what it is signaling is a couple different things. So one, if people really are using dugout canoes, transport constraints like weight aren't as big of a factor. So if it's less costly to transport raw material, you're not so worried about reducing it as far at the quarries. But also, flake blanks from these big, blocky, amorphous cores are actually better for producing end scrapers. So this may be people transporting raw material in a form that's going to be more conducive to the production of this tool you're going to need during a really intensive period of time stress. Caribou hide production is highly, highly seasonal. The caribou hide is only in peak condition for a really brief window during late summer. During the spring, they get all these fly larvae that hatch out from their skin and they look like Swiss cheese. So not very good for clothing. Later, late fall, early winter, the hair gets really thick and kind of brittle, and it's not as good for insulation, at least as far as people are concerned. And they just get really heavy. So you've got this real brief window where you need to produce all of your clothing for the whole year. So I think that's what's probably going on here. People are transporting rock and gearing up so that they're ready for that real brief period of intensive activity. Okay, so by and large, we saw what models like MVT predicted as far as short site residence times, long transport distances. Sites are all pretty similar. They're not very dense. They're functionally redundant. People don't seem to be hanging out very long. And we see a lot of investment in these organic transportation-related technologies, so dugout canoes and sewn leather clothing. So they're kind of both sides of the coin. You need dugouts to be mobile in these wet, marshy, boggy, swampy areas during the spring and summer, and then you need sewn, fitted leather clothing to be mobile during the winter. I think we see evidence for a seasonal round between southwest Wisconsin and the Lake Superior shoreline. All these marsh and wetland environments are coming online. They're probably pretty attractive for things like woodland caribou and the people that are going after them. And all the site locations are good spots if you want to monitor game that's hanging out next to these wetlands. Like I said, they're on these little rises that overlook seasonal marshes. We don't have anything that I would point to as a kill site in these areas, which is kind of odd, but one thing that, I don't know, this is total speculation, but at least ethnographically, people actually do hunt woodland caribou from boats. So that could be another potential, use of boat technology. If you're going after a woodland caribou, they kind of treat you like you're a wolf, and they either try and circle that lake or pond that they're hanging out by, or they swim out into the middle. And hunters know that, so they just paddle out after them with a boat, and it's easy pickings. Another thing that's kind of unexpected, at least as far as Paleoindian behavior goes, people always talk about how mobility decisions, toolkit design, transport should all be geared around big game hunting. So you tailor your whole toolkit in anticipation of times of really intensive hunting. So it's focused around what's the best way to transport raw material for things like projectile points. But that's not what we see in these assemblages. People are transporting big blocky cores. They're focusing more on that kind of transportation. So it may actually be the anticipated manufacturing needs or time stress of women that's structuring how toolkits are designed, because hide scraping and clothing production is such an important kind of control on what's going on during the year. So again, this is not like a big surprise, but at least here in northern Wisconsin, typology doesn't have much relation to human behavior. You get a similar kind of adaptive strategy that cross-cuts things that are late Paleo and early Archaic. They all seem to be behaving the same way. I would love to know how much time depth that adaptation has, but we kind of need more direct dates before we can do that. And it's a really similar adaptation to Clovis and Folsom stuff further to the south. These long distance north-south moves, high mobility. It just seems like that system shifts north over time as environments open up and things get a little better. Okay, so that's it. Thanks.